they found that a mutation started to occur where black people gave birth to pigmentless people. Blacks are pigmented types. They gave birth to pigmentless types. Pigmentless types without change of feature. In other words, they would be African in feature, but they would be pigmentless. Okay, their hair, their eyes, and their skin would be pigmentless. That still happens today. A pure African can give birth to pigmentless, but a pure European cannot give birth to a pigmented. Okay, because the European is not original man. He's a mutation of African man. So that you have the albino type, which in the African condition would disappear in 30 years because of the ultraviolet radiation. But in the ice, the problem of ultraviolet radiation is this, that you have three problems in the ice. First of all, the sun is nowhere around. And when it comes out in the summertime, it is weak and tangential. That is, it is slanted rays, it's not straight rays. Okay, then you have the other problem that you have to cover your skin for half the year in heavy animal skins, so then you have another shield from the sun, and then you have to hide in caves near the fire because of the great cold. Okay, that led to the albino type becoming a mutation and then stabilizing itself in the ice, so that you get eye color change, hair color change, and skin color change, but you still have the same bone structure. In other words, they have found skeletons with some skin on them that have pigmentless skin but Africoid features. Okay? Then you have changes occurring that bring about narrowing of the nose. Because of the ice, you have a narrowing of the nose, because you have a tendency for expansive features in heat and contracted features in cold. So that you get contraction, which is the second change, the second mutation. So that when you hear stories like Schweitzer said some years ago when he was alive, and Schweitzer was considered to be a liberal, the African is my brother, but he's my younger brother by several centuries. It's just the opposite. The European is my brother, but he's my younger brother by several centuries. Now, this does not establish inferiority or inferiority of people, because the mutation is not an evolution. I want to make this quite clear. Man did not evolve from the African. The African reached the last evolved stage. Okay, I'm telling you this because this is the argument that has been used for a long time. When I was in graduate school, I was still hearing European teachers telling me that, okay, man was born in Africa, but then he evolved into different kind of man. There's no evolution here. The new studies show that the last evolved type, the highest stage of evolution, this has been shown by convolutions of the brain case size, etc., is the same as in the European, as in the average European. The way they have tried to do this is that they would go into prisons or they would go into hospitals. That's only where they could get good African skulls. And they would find somebody whose brain has been eaten up by a disease or who hasn't read a book in his life, and they would compare that brain with a highly eminent European. No comparison, just like how they compare primitive African societies with highly industrial European societies. Instead of comparing centers of African civilizations with centers of European civilizations in the pre-industrial period, they compare the primitive African with the highly developed European type, so that you don't get a balance, so that you don't really see the lies that are being done. Diop pointed out to me, he said, you cannot imagine the dishonesty of these people. Do you know how many mummies have been destroyed? Thousands! Thousands! These people have destroyed thousands of things that were against their case. Even when he said Ramesses II, and Ramesses II was a pharaoh in one of the most powerful of the dynasties of Egypt. He said, I saw Ramesses. I was one of the few people in the world who saw Ramesses II. He says he was as black as I am, and Sheikh Anta Diop is vividly black. He said when he came back from Paris, he was a white man. They put gamma ray radiation down in that guy and even said he could still establish it through pigmentation studies, but he looked pale, very pale when he came back. And he said that while they may have needed some gamma ray radiation to do some of their studies, it wasn't necessary to that extent. When they realized that it was affecting his pigmentation, they went on and on with it. And you know, the only thing that brought an end to that study was a question I raised. I never knew anything about it. Years passed. I raised this question in 1979. Sheikh Anta Diop never told me what happened to my question until I met him in 1985. Diop said that when he told me, because there are an exchange of letters between us, which I publish in the book next month, where Diop said, we have found tobacco in the belly of Ramesses II, and that alone should show you that Africans did come to America and went back home with the tobacco. And I said, no, that's not a proof, because as I show in my book, there is an African tobacco as well as an American tobacco, and people have made that mistake because linguistics shows us that tobacco comes from dubak, which is an Arabic word meaning glue. Viscosity of the plant produced that word dubak, which was then changed to tobacco. And you have tobacco, and this traveled to America because the Americans never used tobacco for the tobacco plant. They were using that for the pipe. The act of smoking and the pipe. They were not using it for the tobacco plant. They had another word for the tobacco plant. Lots of people got mixed up because they didn't realize the relationship that the Moors had carried that word around, and then it had gone into America with the slaves. And it had been there even before the slaves because of the connection between the Arabs and the Africans in their trade. So I said the only way you can establish whether this is American or African branded tobacco is to take it to your laboratory and study it, or ask the Parisian laboratories to study it. Diop said that when he raised the question, somebody somewhere went into the laboratory and studied this tobacco, and that after that all the studies stopped. Do you know there were 48 laboratories, not one of them published anything after that? And do you know what the rumor is going about Egypt? That body they were studying for years is not the body of Ramesses II. That's how they got out of it. They must have discovered something, we don't know what it is, whether it is African or American tobacco, that made them say that they were studying the wrong mummy. And they covered up everything. 48 laboratories, not a single laboratory published a report. It just disappeared. Now, if that had happened 25 years ago, and we were not bright enough to raise those questions, or to get somebody like Diop into UNESCO, they would have had a whole story on us that would have completely wiped out the history of that event. Now, because we raise questions, they are forced to retreat. So while we do not know, it's the same thing happened with the skeletons in the Virgin Islands. When I raised the question about the skeletons, they said they couldn't date them, they couldn't carbon date them. And when I tried to go further, they told me that I was entering one of the secrets, military secrets of the United States. And then to make it worse for me, they told me what the secret was and told me that if I said anything, I would be deported. So I can't even talk about a skeleton. There's something very, very dangerous is happening here. And it is extremely fortunate that the nature of the system is such, even though it has these elements, the nature of the system is such that it has almost a self-corrective. Because there is a contradiction in this system which is the source of its change. We can make it so. We have to find where that contradiction is, and wherever we find it, we have to expose it. There is in the study of African presence in Northern Europe something that I found quite astonishing. I had read a lot about the Moors. In fact, in 1980, I spent all my summer studying the Moors. I found there were very little real work done on the Moors. And lots of people had just either automatically assumed they were all black or they were all white and Arabic, etc. And this is one of the central things, because what I'm going to say now will startle you, that the Industrial Revolution in Europe would not have been possible without the Moors. The Moors, who are the Moors? The word was first used by the Romans. Moors, whom they called West Africans, in 46 BC, the Romans met the West Africans and called them Moors. M-A-U-R-E-S, Moors, which comes from the Greek moros, meaning dark one, black one. Then we find that the original Moors were people known as the Garamante in the Sahara. But then a complication occurred. Libyans, some of whom were white-skinned, because they have the Tamahu, they have two types of Libyans, the dark-skinned and the white-skinned Libyans. Those of you who saw that spy who was arrested recently in Libya, he's a black man. This is a Libyan spy, you know. It's a strange business. So that you have white-skinned Libyans as well as dark-skinned Libyans. And a type that is fair-skinned was known as the tawny Moor or the white Moors. Okay, but when the Arabs, after Muhammad started charging down into various parts of the world, Arabia at first, before Muhammad, Arabia was very black. This was in the first early part of Arabia, and we find evidence although that an African, Abul Aswan, invented the Arabic script. But by the time Muhammad was born, the African element was in the minority. You have Asiatic and other types coming into Arabia. That type goes out into India, it goes to China, it goes into Africa. When it gets into Africa, however, because it is a small place, because it's spreading itself all over the world, you have a minority Arabian, fair Arabian type entering the black, massive black population and intermarrying with black women, becoming more and more black, so that many people whom you call Arabs in certain parts of the world are black, just as there are some you call Arabs who are fair-skinned types. Okay, this is something that puzzled Malcolm X, because he found when he went into the Muslim world, there were blue-eyed Muslims and black Muslims together. It's a very complicated business when you think of the highly polarized white-black thing in America. However, what happened when they went into Africa is that they started intermingling with these Africans, and eventually the Africans began to build very powerful, you see, religion, regardless of who starts it. If it takes hold, a certain idea, it doesn't have to be religion in a church, whether it is a political idea or religious idea. Once it takes hold very powerfully and unifies people, extraordinary things begin to happen. Europe had Christianity, which had unified it, and Europe, of course, got its Christianity initially out of the African world. But it had helped to unify great parts of Europe. But that had lost its force, its tremendous revolutionary force at this time, whereas Islam was new, it was fresh, it had a tremendous revolutionary fire, and it began to pull peoples together, not just the Arabs. And you find that where it struck in parts of Africa, it pulled a body of people together, and eventually you have the African beginning to realize Europe is just next door, and it's a fairly weak Europe. Let's charge. And that's exactly what happened. You have a probe at first on the man called Tariq, whose name is immortalized in our language on the tariff, because he set a tariff or a tax on the people he first encountered. And then Tariq follows him, and Tariq takes 6,000, he takes It said 6,700 Africans and the rest were fair-skinned Berber and Arabian types, but 6,700 of the first army to go into Europe under the Moors is African. And that defeats the Spanish. Now I want you to note that the civilization of the Moors were built in Spain and parts of Portugal. It is not an accident that it was Spain and Portugal who eventually made the first thrust out into America, because they gained tremendously from the Moorish invasion. Let me say something now about the Moorish invasion. There were 4 Muslim dynasties in Europe. The first one is called the Umayyad dynasty. It runs from about 716 to 750 AD. It is followed, there is fighting among the Muslims. This is one of the things that often causes a lot of trouble, because the Muslims are divided into Shiites and Sunnites. This is something that happened after the death of Muhammad. There was a faction that wanted one person to succeed Muhammad because of hereditary lines. Another section felt it should be a question of an election. And so battles began between the Sunnites and the Shiites. So after the first great dynasty had been in power, the Umayyad dynasty, the Shiites went and murdered 70 members of the royal family while they were holidaying in Damascus, and the dynasty fell. The Shiites took power, but they only took power for a short time.